Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. So today we're going to dive into the topic of trauma, but we're really going to focus today on a conversation about understanding how to conceptualize what the source of trauma is and how relevant is understanding the source of a personal trauma in healing trauma. We're going to talk about that. And we're going to get into the sources of trauma, within a lifetime and intergenerational trauma. So beyond one lifetime, and, a lot to sort of unpack here. So it's going to be definitely a very interesting dive into just understanding this concept of trauma. And we'll probably also want to define trauma, right, Will?
I was just going to say that I think is the first starting point.
Yeah.
Why
don't we start there together? Why don't you take a stab at that, and then I'll fill in any blanks that I can.
Yeah. I like this conversation. We, we've been fortunate, you and me, to have a lot of contact with Peter Levine and from somatic experiencing. And one of the things I learned from Peter is that trauma can be defined as a pattern of dysregulation in the nervous system, which is very different from defining trauma as an event. And I like this way of defining trauma because some people who have PTSD or who have trauma will come in and say, well, how come I have PTSD from a car accident where, my friend had a car accident and didn't get PTSD from the car accident? And it's confusing for people. So we could talk more about that, but I really like talking with my patients about the pattern in the nervous system.
Yeah, I think I mostly conceptualize it that way for myself, and people I talk to about it now is this certain types of patterns of the nervous system, right? A nervous system that's not operating in kind of synergy with the different systems, the subsystems of the nervous system. It's kind of like a instrument that's not tuned.
Right.
Like you broke a string or you went out of tune, and there's a lot of sort of chaotic frequency going on in the nervous system. So I like this definition of trauma as a nervous system dysregulation. But I think there's also some kind of psychological aspect typically that expresses itself into. Because I think there's probably other types of dysregulated nervous systems that wouldn't just be trauma. I mean, there's nervous systems that are injured, let's just say that aren't necessarily, neurological injuries and stuff to the nervous system that can play out differently. Right. So we're talking about a specific type of issue going on in the nervous system.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not just a generically injured nervous system. It's a very particular pattern of unregulated signaling in the nervous system. And I agree, it tends to have a psychological component as well, of course.
There's another aspect of, so we have the nervous system, which is sort of the biological marker, you could say, which can be measured to some degree, right?
Absolutely.
People are doing that work.
Oh, yeah.
That work's getting better and better over time of measuring the nervous system, physiological responses to try and, hook someone up to neurofeedback and things where you could be like, look, this person has this sort of traumatized pattern in their nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
There's another interesting aspect for me in the conversation of what causes trauma. So you have this dysregulated nervous system, and then, as we've talked to Peter over time, trauma is not necessarily an event because two people could have the same event and not be traumatized. But something happens during the event that turns into trauma. for one person and doesn't for the other, right?
Right.
It's a way, it's something that happens during the event or string of events, especially in more complex traumas, string of events usually. So we could talk about that a little too. I think that's important to mention, of what's happening during the event. It's, the nervous system isn't resetting, right?
Yeah. There's a whole sequence of events that mammals go through, from moving out of a sense of relaxation, a sense of security in your environment, into now detecting a threat, into now beginning to activate, usually unconsciously, because these things are very sudden, right? When you get attacked or something sudden happens, moving into a sequence of getting away from the threat or fighting, fight or flight. And then very interesting work with polar bears and other animals, seeing how they shake off the activation, the autonomic activation, the sympathetic nervous system activation, and then returning back into regulation, returning back into a balance or coherence is something that the neurofeedback people will use the term, which reflects a dynamic balance between parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. So this whole sequence of events is natural and healthy, but that sequence gets interrupted,
Right.
In an event that produces a traumatic pattern of dysregulation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the interruption, one understanding I have from my SE exploration and others is that kind of one of the hallmarks of the interruption process is dissociation of some form, where presence is lost to a experience that seems undigestible to stay present with. This is all things that we're not thinking about when this happens, but whether it's, during a response system that's, we're going into fight, flight, freeze, collapse, whatever it is, but we lose presence, and that dissociative mechanism, where we disconnect from the event in some way that keeps the memory in our system of the event in a usually non-descriptive way, but sometimes we have, PTSD and flashbacks and things, but usually the memory isn't stored in our body, right?
Yeah.
Would you say that differently?
No, I agree with how you said it. I would add that it's not always the case, but it's often the case that dissociation you're talking about that can occur during a threat response, leading into a traumatic patterning that's left over, often is paired with a sense of helplessness in the moment. So that helplessness could take the form of, for some of my patients, I'm driving a car and it starts to slide on ice. There's a helplessness because I can't control the car anymore. Mm-hmm. Or a victim of sexual assault might be held down and immobilized during the assault. So there's a feeling of helplessness. So helplessness it's not always there, but it's often there in this moment of dissociation. Right.
Well, I think that, helplessness is probably the aspect that's not, it's very hard to stay present with that severe level of helplessness. Dissociation obviously has another function in the moment, right? There's a healthy function to it in a certain way when something's happening to us that is unbearable.
Yeah.
The brain, the psyche has a way of dealing with unbearable experiences.
Yeah.
But the challenge is then we can stay traumatized from staying dissociated from an unbearable experience.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because dissociation sometimes gets a negative connotation that we think it's associated with trauma. And so we think of it as sort of a pathological event that we dissociate. But in fact, it's an important nuance that dissociation is a survival strategy, that it, in terms of ego defenses, it's one of the key early primitive ego defenses, is that we have the capacity inside of our mind to check out from something difficult or painful or overwhelming that's occurring. But as you said, what hasn't been digested, what hasn't been directly experienced through presence remains. It's sort of like throwing something in the basement. Like sometimes I throw my clothes down the stairs to the basement where the laundry room is. And then I open the door and there's clothes everywhere on the stairs. So it's like that kind of metaphor of your mind, where there are things in there that haven't been dealt with that are going to have to be dealt with later.
Yeah. And so another kind of nuance here is that in order to resolve these traumas, at least in modern trauma therapies, it's not always necessary, sometimes not even helpful, to revisit the actual content of the trauma, although to some degree that usually gets revisited. But obviously reenacting traumas isn't typically how this work is done anymore. But usually the content's visited somehow, but that it seems like the most important part of the work in healing the trauma is somehow being able to access the sensory experience that was overwhelming, and being able to digest that sensory experience. So there's still a memory typically in us of a sensory experience of the thing that we, saw as traumatic that we haven't confronted, right? Mm-hmm. And that's just sort of like lingering in our bodies and our systems. And there's ways to get into that in very clever and soft and graceful ways to get into that experience so that it's digestible.
Right.
Do you agree with this kind of way of talking about it?
Yeah. It's a really important piece. I don't think it can be overemphasized that going on an expedition to try to locate the event that underlies the traumatic patterning in the nervous system isn't what produces the therapeutic effect. In other words, we can work with and heal and integrate and digest traumatic events by working with the state, like you were saying, working with the somatic state that was associated with the event, and which, for people with trauma in their system, they often feel that state coming forward. And some people would say, and I agree, that the reason that state keeps coming forward is because it's unintegrated and it needs to be healed. It's coming forward for a reason, but it feels like intrusive thinking. It feels like it can be cold sweats. It could be panic attacks. It could be any number of really uncomfortable experiences, nausea, disgust, so many different experiences.
Right. And for me, let's bring this a little more on the ground now. So, and let me just kind of throw out a few things. So obviously there are singular events that are traumatic that, it's, a person got in a massive car accident. It's like there's they're having PTSD about crashing, right? And that has its own particular flavor of how to help someone process and digest that experience. And then, so there are singular events. There's events that are, violations to our bodies in a different way, sexual events or string of events. There's all kinds of things. Anything could be traumatic ultimately for a person. Mm-hmm. And then there's, the complex trauma events of childhood, usually is what that term's typically used for, where it's a long-standing emotional, sometimes physical injuries are happening. usually by primary caregivers. That's not one event, right? That you're just gonna be like, that was the thing in your head. That could just be sort of like a big kind of picture of a, so many events, and like that's this big thing. So like returning to events there are sometimes helpful, but it's also typically it's a lot of more amorphous when we're talking about complex trauma around like just revisiting events. And then there's the other concept that's getting a lot more traction to look at, which is intergenerational trauma. So, events that happened in our lineage prior to our incarnation, right? Prior to our conception. And so that's a whole nother area. So I'll pause there, but I want to talk a little bit about intergenerational trauma a little bit too, but I don't know where you want to take all that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And those layers of depth in the psyche, in the collective unconscious, you could say, whether it's within your own lineage or within the storehouse of human experience. Mm-hmm. Outside of your own personal genetic lineage, there can be plenty of material that can come up when people are in a healing process.
Definitely. I mean, there's cultural trauma, there's societal traumas, systemic,
right? Structural racism,
systemic violations of trauma. So, I want to talk a little bit about intergenerational trauma for a moment. And I mean, for myself, you know me pretty well, but I had probably a pretty high level of a traumatized nervous system. Like in terms of how traumatized nervous systems get, I was pretty up there, right?
Yeah.
What would you say about yourself in relation to, your upbringing and the level of trauma in your nervous system? I'm just curious what you would say about yourself.
Well, it took me a long time to acknowledge how much trauma there was in my body from childhood. It wasn't until I was in my 40s and I had already been in trauma therapy for quite a few years before I had a series of experiences that really cracked things open for me and showed me that there was a tremendous amount of lockdown and kind of not knowing, quote unquote, like my ego defenses were very strong and worked really well and kept me unaware of how much was going on in my childhood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that would be my sense of you, is you also had pretty high levels of dysregulation, right? In your system that we would call trauma. And well, I think it's really important to say that, I don't view trauma as like this, like, negative, horrible thing. And I think that it's important to recognize most human beings have a big piece of work to do around some aspect of their nervous system that's traumatized and dysregulated. Most human beings don't just kind of skate through life and don't have that. Most have, and I think that there's sometimes stereotypes of like, well, you didn't have the big event. It's not, it's not fair to like throw around the terms if there wasn't this event that's so horrible. Or the thing is that in the end, the nervous system will show that I think many, many humans are holding trauma from wherever that need to get worked through. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, our history as human beings is quite violent and dark in a lot of ways. It's also, there's beauty in it as well. So I don't mean to rule that out, but we've been through, a lot as a species. And but I think it's a really important piece, again, that you're bringing here, that we can't. Most people think about trauma as like only a few people have it, or, there's a statistic that 10 million people in the US have PTSD, and
Right.
there's 400 million of us. So
Right.
that would be like, 1 in 40 or something like that. But it's really, I think it's a myth, to be honest, that only a few people that you meet or that are carrying trauma. I think it's way more realistic what you're saying, that all of us have something that we're holding.
Well, yeah. Yeah. And maybe it doesn't show up in the symptom cluster that we see in the DSM, but I think it's much more realistic to say, like, the human experience, part of the human experience. I mean, one part of the human experience is we get to like soak this thing in and it's amazing. Another part of the human experience is like we're working through releasing trauma in our nervous system. That's an aspect of the human experience. And some people will learn about that and learn how to do it. And other people will avoid that and be ruled by it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, what was interesting in my path, where I had plenty, as you know, of early childhood experiences to sort of, I could point my finger to. So many I could point my finger to, being like, well, that's the trauma, right? There was so much there that I could point my finger at. But some of my most significant healing was intergenerational trauma work for myself. I didn't spend hundreds of hours looking at, scenarios I was in with my parents. I've done some of that, but it wasn't, I spent way more hours looking at my intergenerational trauma. Now that's really interesting. So, and I could say a little more for the listener about what I'm talking about, right? So I'm Jewish, and for me, I got clued in for some reason to that there was intergenerational trauma in my system around the Holocaust. I didn't have, very direct descendants that were there. I had indirect descendants that were there, but I got clued in a long time ago now, 15 years ago. I don't remember when it was, that this is, crushing me. Right. And I was, I'm like a trauma case. Like I was mentally ill. I was sick. Right. So I was the DSM definition with a lot of others in there. So, but what was so fascinating is the pieces that helped me, the source material that I identified as some of my biggest levers weren't even about this lifetime, yet maybe a lot of what I was dealing with was this lifetime. That's up in the air for me. It's very possible a lot of my nervous system memory was this lifetime. But what helped me a lot to really move the levers here was to really focus on this Holocaust piece. And I could say more about how I did that. But to me, that's very interesting because it was a source that, for whatever reason, allowed me to contextualize the sensory experience that was not digestible in a way that I was actually able to relate to that source. Now, I don't know why that was, and maybe that was the source. That's another possibility. Yeah. I'll pause there.
Well, and the Holocaust was one of many pogroms, right, for the Jewish people. I mean, I'm not Jewish, but my understanding is, there's been a pattern of persecution that's a lot older than just 20th century. So
that's correct, especially yes. And for the last 600 to 800 years, definitely intensely in Europe. And when I did the work, I kind of went further back a little in myself, and the bulk of the releases for me were about the Holocaust for whatever reason. But I did have a few releases I mean, I'll contextualize this a little more, as you know. So I started getting clued into this. I started sort of working with different practitioners, SE and some other somatic people and all these things to try and access this work. The first time I actually clued into this, but I blew it off. The very first time I clued into this was way earlier. I was 20. I was 21. First time I clued into intergenerational trauma was I did LSD, and I hadn't done LSD. I did LSD maybe 2 times prior to that. I haven't done a lot of LSD. Maybe I did it another 1 or 2 times after that. And so I was on LSD, and I'm sitting in a room with 3 other people, and all of a sudden I just start seeing swastikas everywhere, and they start flying at me, and they're cutting me, and I was totally afraid, and like I wasn't in a group to process that, you know. So I'm sitting there and I'm getting attacked by these like ninja star like SWAT stickers, and they're all over the walls, you know. And I remember being like, all I took away in that moment, because there was no talk of intergenerational trauma. I mean, there was basically no internet yet. Like, I had no information, right? The only information I had was my own experience in that moment. But I remember leaving that experience going like, wow, this event that happened in the Holocaust, like, I think it's impacting me. And that was it. I just like, I think that's doing something to me.
Yeah.
But
sounds really scary.
That's all I did, right? I kind of said that to myself, and it was over, and I just kind of moved on in my frozen nervous system that I was already in, you know, for years. But I clued into it then. And then this next round, when I, you know, started in my early 30s, where I had some good people, some good therapist healers around me to help sort of inquire just very softly. And it opened up a massive rabbit hole for me that led to me, you know, going out to Poland and Germany and visiting the camps. And when I was in the camps is when I really felt at least again, I'm saying this was a source, but, you know, I really felt something finally made sense for me of like, wow, all this confusion and all this just deep, extreme trauma in my system. I didn't grow up in a horrible situation whatsoever, right? It started making sense when I was walking through the camps. I'll tell a quick story. So when I first got to the camp, Buchenwald, I think that's how you say it, which was like the headquarters. It was one of the headquarters for Hitler. And I get to the camp. Did I ever tell you this story? I might have told you.
I don't think so. Okay. I don't think I've heard this.
I walk up to the camp, and the fog was so thick that I couldn't see more than a couple inches in front of my face. I couldn't see my feet. That's how thick the fog was.
Wow.
So I'm walking into the camp through the gates. I can't see anything. I have no idea what I'm walking on. I have no idea where I'm going. And all of a sudden, I had this full body knowing of like, this is fucking terrifying. And this is how I've been feeling. And this is nothing compared to what people were feeling. It was like, I just had this moment of, this is nature's way of showing me a hairline glimpse of the level of intensity that was here.
Wow.
And, you know, I was just like blown open, and I couldn't walk. And I was basically walking around blindfolded, you know, trying to find things. And this went on for like 30 minutes until the fog lifted. So anyways, I went through this big journey there, and, you know, there were a number of things that resonated with my whole body where I was like, that's my body's feeling. And it was like the first time I was feeling my body again in the pain. It was like, oh, that's the pain. Like, there it is. Like, I can feel it. You know, that dissociation from the body and the sensory experience. And the second thing that really dropped me in was when there was this was in Auschwitz, I think. There was a room in Auschwitz. I'm also aware of all the listeners out there, and these are intense things to talk about. So take care of yourself.
Yeah.
But there was a room in Auschwitz where they would take the prisoner. It was like a, torture cellar. Okay. They would take the prisoner and they would hang them up on a hook by the back of their shirt. They would hang them on this hook and then they would strangle them to death. That was how yeah. So I was in this room and I was sitting there and they would strangle them with belts. And again, I'm aware of everybody here and it's intense for me to talk about it because I feel this. I had another resonance. I was meditating in that room for hours. I just sat in that room for hours in a corner of the room and I was just trying to feel my body. And again, it was like all this horrible feeling that I could barely sense in my body, but was driving me completely insane. Like I was just feeling it all. I was like, just the terror and the hopelessness and the just how unjust and that's a part of trauma, right? There's an experience of just how unjust, whether that traumatic the relationship to that event is just how unjust the event was. That also causes dissociation when something is just not digestible because it's too unjust to conceive that it can happen.
Right. Like some of not to derail your story, but some of the veterans I've worked with who have some version of moral injury where they witnessed or performed or were complicit in atrocities that would register as a war crime.
Yeah.
If anyone knew about it, right? Yeah.
It's a good example. And and then just when you get that mirror of something like that, where again, it's like identifying a source that just brings understanding. Even if it wasn't the actual source or it was the actual source, sometimes it is the actual source. It can provide a gateway, right, into making sense of the sensory overwhelm. That can help relax people to start to digest the overwhelm. Some people. It did for me, and I and there's so many others on this journey I had where I'm going to end right now with the last story. So I'm flying home from Poland. I get on my plane in Poland, and I get in my seat, and I'm just like frazzled. I'm tender and frazzled. I'm like, what is this world about, and what's going on, and like, is everybody facing these like ancient traumas? And I'm just in a big existential kind of not getting it.
How old are you at this time?
30, early 30s, 33, 34, probably. I think. So over 10 years ago, like probably 12 to 13 years ago. And I'm sitting next to this like 95-year-old guy or something, really old guy. And he asked me like, oh, well, whatever, with his accent, what were you doing in Poland? And I told him just a little snippet of my story. I just was like, I'm going to just tell this guy. And then he tells me that he was a teenager in the SS Guard, in the Nazi. He was a Nazi.
Oh my goodness.
Being indoctrinated to be a Nazi. And then he just like put his hand on my forearm and he's just like, I'm so sorry that I contributed to this for you.
Wow. And
then he turned away and went back in his newspaper. I didn't even know these people were still out and about in the world. A lot of these people got arrested and,
sure.
It was a teenager and maybe that's what that was. I don't know what that was. So that happens. And then I immediately shit my pants.
Wow.
Did I tell you this story?
No.
So I shit my pants right there. Like, I don't even, it's like nothing. It's like the whole thing, my whole system just releases. And I felt like I released something in that moment, even though it was an unpleasant smell for everybody on the plane. It was some kind of weird, like the nervous system finally got rid of something. So I'm gonna end there. That was a big story, but yeah, I haven't told that story publicly, but I'm gonna end there. But I think I'm bringing it into the space of the source that we identify is only useful if it's useful.
Yeah.
That's I think what I understand about trauma is like when we want to work with a source story, which we need to, most people need to, but it's only useful if we're using it to heal.
Yeah, I think that speaking of the concentration camps, what I'm hearing you refer to is existential meaning. And it brings up for me, of course, Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning, and that suffering that has meaning is bearable and suffering that has no meaning is unbearable for human beings.
Mm-hmm.
When I read that, and I encourage our listeners to read that book. I mean, it's essential reading, in my opinion, as a human being, period, end of story. If you're interested in trauma, for sure. But that need for meaning is huge for us as human beings.
Right.
And I think there are people who heal trauma with more of a kind of frame of narrative and story. And then there are people, and I'm one of these people, where there's more of a somatic, talk about shitting your pants. That's a very somatic experience, right? I'm like, wow. It was for your people around you on the plane as well. They're having a somatic experience.
Yeah, everyone had an experience.
But yeah, I think I think that for some people, there's more of a processing that happens that may not be as narrative oriented as it is for others.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a good point too, which is that there are people that actually narrative modalities works really well for them. And existential narrative modalities can do that. It can totally do that. And there are people that, are very body-based. Interestingly, I'm not that body-based. Like I have trouble accessing my body, but my body, as most bodies do, once you can get it online, tends to have a mechanism of releasing itself in the body.
Right.
It's just that accessing the body isn't always a somatic practice to access it. For some people, they do it through visualization and eventually their body just releases. Some people do it through talk therapy and then their body catharts, right? So there are different ways the body will come online.
Yeah. And on the narrative side, there is a way to use the narrative as a defense against what really needs to be felt and digested. And, before I learned somatic experiencing, I did a lot of cognitive therapy with people. And sometimes it was great. And some, it could be highly effective remodeling negative thinking, but it also, I found, had a lot of limitations in terms of working with trauma, because sometimes it further solidifies an intellectual attitude toward the past, or, and so, I just wanted to name that as well, that there's a way that I think what you're talking about sounds like is like linking the narrative with like getting the body involved in the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a way of finding a narrative that leads you to releasing the body.
Right.
The body. The narrative somehow ends up becoming a mirror to be able to feel and sense what's in the body. And it's like looking in a mirror from that narrative.
Right.
But there are also narratives, obviously, I think the delicate piece around identifying the source and then also focusing on the source narrative and replaying it. There's often a mechanism, which is more a dissociative mechanism, which is using a narrative in the psyche to disconnect and avoid the overwhelm.
Right.
Through, a fast moving narrative, that's pendulating between like overwhelm, fast moving narrative, but you can't ever resolve that.
Right. Right. Exactly. I'm reminded of a movie called My Life as a Dog. Have you ever seen that movie? It's actually a World War II movie, and it opens up with a child telling a narrative about, it wasn't really that bad. And, the child is a child during, with bombs dropping, and using this dissociative narrative to cope, to survive, to get through. And again, not to throw that under the bus. I think it's so important to acknowledge and be grateful for the narratives that help us to get through. But then there's a point in time where just getting through is not anymore an accurate response to what the context is, and there's a deeper healing that's available if we can break through that shell.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I think that most people that I've spoken to or worked with, and some of the trauma experts we've talked to, have all said something similar, which is most humans that have a big trauma in their nervous system that go do the work and heal it, typically they come out of that with a growth-oriented narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Like almost always. From the people we've spoken with, you and I have had a lot of, clients we've seen over the years. And like, when you really see the resolution, anyone I've worked with, when they've really resolved it, this growth-oriented narrative comes out of the experience from that never should have happened, right? That's an abomination. Right. Should never have happened to me. It's unfair it happened to me.
Right.
This, now there's meaning of like, here's how I'm going to live a better life going forward with this happening to me, right? This growth-oriented narrative comes out of it.
Yeah.
We don't start there in trauma.
No.
Because that's the result of resolving the nervous system, right?
Yeah. You probably should not tell someone who has acute trauma symptoms that one day they'll be grateful that for this experience.
Yeah, because it's not where they are at.
No. But
or that they are there, they're just making that up intellectually, typically.
Right, exactly. But there does come a time often in post-traumatic growth, is what I'm hearing you talk about now, is a time that comes when you realize that because you love who you are right now, and you wouldn't want to be a different person right now, that there's no other you, there's no alternative reality, and you deeply appreciate everything, every ingredient in the soup that made you who you are now, you can't leave that out. You can't leave out the traumatic event. And then you start to see how the traumatic event actually made you who you are today.
Yeah, it was a aspect of your experience that happened to you.
Right.
That is, I've told people that I've worked with who were severely traumatized. I wasn't a trauma like only specialist, but I worked with a handful that were like, the level of trauma was just, the worst you can imagine type of stuff. Daily sexual abuse for years of childhood, like intense, horrible stuff. One thing I've worked with people around in the healing process of trauma is like, if you have large portions of your life that shouldn't have happened, and then you can't feel whole. There's no way to reconcile that. You can't feel whole in your experience if you're denying parts of your experience.
Right.
And then you're also denying parts of your experience moving forward, right? It's like we don't want to wish these things to happen to us. But you can't feel whole when you're denying parts of your reality that have happened. And that's hard work. That's hard work to get there, where you're willing to embrace the reality that you are living into and to create something meaningful out of that reality. Because everybody's got some history, and many people were born in situations that's got some really, really horrible, nasty history going on at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also thinking about another trap, which is the trap of kind of, and you just mentioned it, but there's this trap of kind of dismissing the horrific impact of trauma by saying, well, it just kind of makes you who you are, and you make lemonade out of lemons, and like that
Right.
kind of way of dismissing people's experience that is so prevalent, sadly, in I would say in American culture, right? In this culture of denial, where how are you today? I'm fine.
Yeah.
It's one of Gabor's best sort of jokes about Americans is like, I'm fine.
I'm fine.
What does that mean?
Nothing to see here. I'm fine. Nothing to see here. Move on.
And having that
pleasantry of asking a question that we don't want a real answer to.
Yeah. And it's tender. It's there's a lot to feel, and it's hard to be a human and be one who, even if you're committed to waking up or personal growth or healing, it's blood, sweat, and tears, to really encounter life in a raw and full way. It's not a walk in the park. That's for damn sure.
It's not for everyone, and it's hard work, right. And there's just magic. We haven't focused today on the magic of what comes out of healing, and the opening when we heal these fractured parts of ourselves, the gratitude that can be felt when we mend these broken shards. Borrow from a Jewish term. Judaism, there's this concept that tikkun olam, where it's like there's just the shards of, one way of thinking about it is like reality was just like a piece of glass and it was slammed on the ground, and there's just shards everywhere. And like the work of healing on the planet and the beauty is you're putting back together this piece. It's like a mosaic, and you're putting it back together, and like it makes this thing when you do that. And that's like the work. That's the journey. So there's a magic there that we haven't talked a lot about today. But I'll end with a quick story of magic when this was coming to rest for me, this work in a big way. Well, there's actually a couple stories, but one is that, when did you and I go to Brazil? When was that? How many years ago? 7 years ago, 8 years ago?
I think it was, about 8. I think it might have been 8, something like that.
So we went to Brazil together, obviously, and Emma was there, my wife, and we're in a session with Enrique, who is the shaman there, and I don't think you were in this session with us, but so Enrique tells us he's doing the divination. Remember his big oracle pit?
Yeah, West African shamanism.
That was cool. So he's doing his divination with us. He knows nothing about me. Now I'm about, multiple years in now on the tail end of this piece around the Holocaust. And he tells us that we were in a past life together, me and Emma, and we were in the Holocaust. And we were in a horse and carriage fleeing from the Nazis. They weren't chasing us. We were fleeing out of the country, going through, back roads, and trying to meander our way out of there. And we were this, old Jewish couple getting out of, I don't remember if he said Germany or not. I can't remember where. And horse and buggy, but that we ended up and we felt like we made it. We thought we made it. And then right toward the end legs of our journey, they found us and shot us.
Wow.
Now here's the magic of this story. So that in and of itself is a little dark, but like 1 or 2 weeks later, I go to my house in New Jersey. Did I ever tell you this story? Okay.
I don't think so.
1 or 2 weeks later, I go to my house in New Jersey and I go into a room in my parents' house. Now on the wall is this small little painting of an old Jewish couple from like the shtetl from Europe on a horse.
What's the shtetl? What is shtetl?
The shtetl is like it's like a ghetto. It's like where the Jews lived. It was poor neighborhoods in old Europe. And one extra piece was he said we were traveling always at night under the stars, like hide out during the day, travel at night. So there's this painting in my parents' house in a corner, and it's a painting of an old Jewish man and woman on a horse and buggy traveling through the night. And I go to my parents and I go, was that painting with us since I was born? They're like, yeah, we got that right before you were born. We were in Israel, in Safad, this mystical city in Israel. And they're like, we don't know why we bought it. We just thought it was interesting. It's been there my whole life. And I was like, okay. So in that moment, it was like there was almost like a feeling of like, things make sense, even though we can't understand them. And there's enough magic in the world to heal these things. When we're just like ready to see, and to receive the mirrors, right? There's so many mirrors out there for us to just be like, oh, yes. And like, and I don't know past lives or not. Like I don't have a strong opinion there, but like this narrative kept unfolding for me that allowed me to make sense of my existence on this planet, right? And I think that that's a part of our work. It's not always so mystical for people, right? Part of our work on healing traumas is we need to release the body and then create meaning that allows us to like feel good about our lives.
Yeah. What comes to mind is that narratives are a tool, right?
Yeah.
And we need to be aware of the benefits and drawbacks of the tool and how we apply the tool in our lives.
Right. Well, let's wrap up there, which is narratives are a tool. Let's be aware of the stories we tell ourselves. As a friend of ours, remember Greg used to say to me, if you're going to tell a story, tell a good one.
Yeah.
You're going to tell a story to yourself, tell a good one.
Just thinking about him.
It's a good little mantra.
It is.
You might as well tell a good story, because if you're going to tell any story, well, why not tell a good one?
Yeah.
Okay, let's end there.
Thanks.
Thanks.